much. Thank you.
Thank you. You're welcome.
And I heard this sound that sounded like a bomb drop. It was a peregrine falcon. Right past me. Right past me. The voice is towards the nature. You don't realize that they sound like a bomb from close to
Find that number. Check, check. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the first annual Sam Farr's Pinnacles Service Award and Dinner Auction. Just to let you know, we will be starting our dinner service shortly, so we appreciate if you would find your table and take your seats. Thank you very much.
Good evening, everyone. I hate to interrupt your dinner, but if I could just have your attention for a few moments. Hello, everyone. Can everyone outside and inside hear me? My name's Jennifer Westfall. I'm the Executive Director of the Pinnacles National Park Foundation. Thank you. I just want to welcome you all here tonight to our first annual Sam Farr Pinnacles Service Award Dinner and Auction. This is the first time that we've done an event like this. It's definitely been a learning experience, and I think it's turned out fabulously so far. So some of you may not be that familiar with our organization. For the last 10 years, we've been known as Pinnacles Partnership, and we are the philanthropic partner to Pinnacles National Park. And so it's our job to work with our partners at the NPS and support them in the things that they maybe don't have the support for. So they come to us with their asks, and we do our best to fundraise for them. And we have a lot of growing to do. And so we are really hoping that with our name change to the Pinnacles National Park Foundation, it'll help raise awareness of who we are and how we support the park, and hopefully can expand our awareness in the local community and with our donor base. And we really appreciate all of you coming out and supporting us with this inaugural event. I'm probably talking way too long, but I wanted to introduce Addie Bakich, who is going to be our Master of Ceremonies tonight, to try and keep us moving along. And with that, well, I want to say one more thing. You know, protecting parks are a really, I'm tearing up already, are a really important thing. And I wanted to relay a story that was in the news. I'm Canadian, if you didn't know, I might say about a little bit. So there was a story in the news where my husband and I met from Narcissus, Manitoba the other day, where some snakes, tens of thousands of snakes come out of the ground every spring, and it's just a sight to see. And out in this wilderness management area, they are protected. But outside of the wilderness management area, they're not protected. And somebody killed a lot of snakes the other day. And it was a really sad thing to hear, and it really made me think about how having these places, these protected places, is really important. Sorry. So in 2013, after many years of work, I mean, the original, we have some Hanes in the room here tonight. That was the goal all along, was to have Pinnacles be a national park. And that extra level of protection from a monument to a national park, it does make a difference to have those places preserved. So thank you, Sam, for that. I'm sorry.
Thank you, Jennifer. Was that a lot of passion, folks, or what? Okay. I'm Addie Bakich. I'm your auctioneer for this evening. I'll also be your mistress of ceremonies. And we just want to thank you all for being here again. And we'll be starting the live auction. Also, the silent auction, I believe, is still open. So if anyone wants to make any final bids, now would probably be your time to do it. If not, we'll keep it open for a little longer, and hopefully to make as much money as we can for such a fantastic organization. So thank you again for being here, and I'm going to start the live auction in about 5 minutes. Okay, there's been a little correction. We're actually going to let you eat first and enjoy your meal, and then I'm going to pick your pockets. Check, check. Ladies and gentlemen, I hope you enjoyed your salad. The next item we're going to talk to Karen Dorn. Karen is the superintendent of Pinnacles National Park. We're going to bring Karen up, and she's going to say a few words tonight. Thank you, Karen.
Well, good evening, everyone, and thank you for coming tonight. And thank you, John, for traveling down. It's good to see you again. And Congressman Farr, he's mingling. I'm Karen Dorn. I'm the superintendent of Pinnacles National Park. And we can't do many wonderful things without the help of our Pinnacles National Park Foundation. I'd like to thank the board members, who I'm sure are scattered throughout the audience tonight, and they've heard me use this metaphor many a time. We receive funds from Congress to take care of the basics at the park. I kind of like to say we bake the cake, right? We keep the bathrooms open, we do some programs, we keep things operating, the basics for the Condor program. That's the cake. But I don't know about you, but I like cake with frosting. I like lots of frosting. And that's where Pinnacles National Park Foundation comes in. They help us do the extraordinary things that raise the park up higher. They help us bring kids from Seaside, California to the park for an overnight camp in the campground, where they learn about science and connect with natural resources in a learning environment. And I get to make a very special announcement tonight. One of the really amazing things that the Pinnacles National Park Foundation does is help us take care of our California Condor program. Yeah. So you all, by being here, you're part of taking care of one of the 10 most endangered birds in the world. The California condor is so endangered that the 290 plus or minus birds that are flying out there over California, over Arizona, over Baja, Mexico, they are tagged, they are monitored, they are part of a research population. Well, I'm very pleased to announce that the Pinnacles National Park Foundation has secured a grant of assistance and funds through the National Park Foundation, through work with the National Park Foundation, of 20 GPS condor tags for the birds associated with Pinnacles National Park and the monitoring per year. So let me tell you what impact that is. That is an $80,000 grant of support. $80,000. And I asked our Condor program manager, what is that impact to the park? So I'm afraid I have to read, but it's such important stuff, it's worth reading. So the GPS tags that we're going to receive through this grant, they fit onto the condors and they give us very accurate data as to the location of the condor, each condor, so that we will know very quickly if one stops flying around and moving, we will know that really fast and be able to respond quickly to see if they're ill. These GPS tags are a way that we'll be able to find condor nests quicker. And that will help us take care of the chicks. There's a lot that the condor biologists have to do once a chick is born. We give them vaccinations, we check their health, we monitor their health. By having GPS tags on the parent animals, we'll be able to find those nests quicker. And this will help us understand how the numbers of condors increase over time. The GPS tags will help us improve our program efficiency. The data is sent via satellite, and that is part of this grant that we're receiving, is the satellite data and satellite tracking. It's also through cell phone. Condors call home, we kind of like to say. So it will help us save on staff time and let our staff take care of other things as needed. And it will also increase the safety of our staff. They do some incredible things, from climbing up redwood trees and dropping off of cliffs to find the birds. But this way, we'll be able to watch them a little easier through the GPS monitoring. And the GPS tags will help us understand the greatest threats to condor survival by helping us locate any bird very quickly when they unfortunately pass away. And we'll be able to collect the bird and take it in to find out what happened. So let me tell you a little bit more about the tags. Each tag costs $4,000. It's going to last 5 to 8 years. And in most likelihood can have the battery replaced and continue monitoring the condor for quite a while after that. The monthly fee, there would be a monthly fee of $100 per bird per month, and that is being covered. And the company that's doing this is called Microwave Telemetry. They're a very small company, but doing very big work. So again, you and Microwave Telemetry and Pinnacles National Park Foundation?
I'm sorry, I have to make a correction.
Oh dear, sorry.
So, the in-kind donation that we have secured with assistance from the National Park Foundation is for the GPS tags from Microwave Telemetry. We do not have the data,
Oh,
the
okay.
monitoring.
Sorry.
So I
But
just
it's
want to
still
make
good.
that clear. So, yes.
Still good.
So we've got the $4,000 tags, but
All
we
right.
don't have the monitoring.
We're good. Bid high. Oops, I'm not supposed to say that. All right, it's still great. It's still wonderful. So yes, by coming here tonight, you are taking care of one of the 10 most endangered birds in the world. So thank you for coming. And I think at that, I'm up next to introduce Director John Jarvis. And I have to say, I do owe John my job here at Pinnacles, because I was working in another region, the Intermountain region, as the Chief of Resource Management at another park. And John helped me get my first superintendency here in the Pacific West region up in Seattle. And that led me next to come to Pinnacles. So I've been very honored to serve with you when you were regional director and for you as director of the Park Service. So Jonathan B. Jarvis is the former director of the National Park Service, serving from October 2009 to January 2017. During his tenure, he led the agency through its centennial, the 100th anniversary of the National Park Service, adding 22 new parks, achieving its largest budget in history, and raising over $400 million in philanthropic support. John began his Park Service career as a seasonal interpretive ranger on the National Mall in 1976, and then moved up through the Park Service as a protection ranger, park biologist, and superintendent at parks such as Guadalupe Mountains in Texas. It's a wonderful park you should visit. Crater Lake National Park in Oregon, North Cascades National Park in Washington State, and Wrangell St. Elias National Park and Preserve in Alaska. So prior to his appointment as director, John served as the regional director of the Pacific West region of the National Park Service, with responsibility for the 58, and now I think it's a few more because of you, John, national parks across the Pacific states and the islands in the Pacific. Throughout his career, John Jarvis has focused on the application of sound science in park management and increasing the relevance to all Americans of the national parks through the places that are protected and the stories they interpret. So, John? Thank you.
Thanks. Thanks, Karen. And thanks to everybody here tonight for joining us in a couple things. One, obviously celebrating the work of the Pinnacles Foundation, Pinnacles National Park Foundation, former Pinnacles Partnership, but also here to honor Sam Farr for his many decades of service to our country and to this part of California. Extraordinary legacy that Sam has left, and I'm going to probably embarrass him a few times tonight as I talk. I'm going to take about 10 minutes to cover a lot of ground. If you can't see the video screen, that's okay. It's not my crutch. It's there to just enhance a little bit. So, as Karen mentioned, the Park Service turned 100 last year in 2016, and I had served for 40 of those years. So I had let's say, a little bit of an opinion about the Park Service and its history. And I know who the true supporters are of the National Park Service out there, and certainly Sam Farr stands near the top of that, if not at the top. His legacy in Congress of supporting us through many battles about saving the parks, not only the national parks, but our public lands as well, and our oceans. And there's a deep connection between this. Yeah. There's a really deep connection between the National Park Service history and California as well. So Stephen Mather was the first director of the National Park Service. He was a California resident, UC Berkeley grad. He made a lot of money in the borax industry in Death Valley. And this is 1914, 1915. He wrote a letter to then Secretary of Interior Franklin Lane, who was also a Berkeley grad, and he complained bitterly about the condition of the few national parks that were out there at the time. And Lane wrote him back and said, "Stephen, if you don't like the condition, come to Washington and run them yourself." And I imagine Sam probably had some sort of similar epiphany at some point about going to Washington and trying to help out as well. Well, Mather understood something that I think all of you understand, is that there is a power in place. If you go out into these places, something happens. So in 1915, Mather gathered up a group of influential individuals, much like in this room, and he took them into the mountains. This was called the Mather Mountain Party. It was July 14, 1915. He had the writers from the Saturday Evening Post. He had the vice president of the Southern Pacific Railroad. He had the publisher of the Visalia newspaper. And as I'm sure Sam would appreciate, he had the ranking congressman on appropriations. He had a professional photographer, and he had the president of the National Geographic Society. There was also one park ranger and two cooks, Ty Singh and his assistant Eugene. Now, Ty Singh was considered the best camp chef in the West, and his specialty was hot sourdough biscuits that were warmed on the rise on the side of a sweaty mule as the mule went up the side of the mountain carrying all of the equipment for these guys. So for 2 weeks, these individuals camped in the high Sierras. They bathed in the streams, and they sat around campfires, and they talked about conservation. They talked about national parks. And when it came down to the last week, the Mather gathered them around the campfire. And you can imagine, seeing the night sky up there in the Sierras, which I'm sure many of you have seen. But he gathered them around this campfire. And he said, I brought you here for a specific reason, not just to experience this, but I want your support. I need your help. That these places, these national parks, really cannot exist without public support. And at the time, there wasn't even a National Park Service. And what he really needed their support for, besides philanthropy, was to create a national park system, a National Park Service. And that evening, every member made that commitment to him to create this place. Now, Pinnacles was already established under the Antiquities Act. Teddy Roosevelt had established Pinnacles National Monument. The Antiquities Act, which, by the way, is a bit under siege these days from this administration. But the designation, transfer, and expansion and ultimate redesignation of Pinnacles National Park very much parallels sort of the history of the National Park Service. And so I'm going to try to delve into that just a little bit. The Park Service is a little different today than it was 100 years ago. This is, if you can't see the slide, that's Gateway National Recreation Area with, millions of visitors in the city of New York City. There are 300 million people in the United States today. 100 years ago, it was less than 100 million. Young people, especially millennials, are immersed in technology and have little interaction with the outdoors. And as many of you probably know, at one time, the outdoors was the domain of children. Not so much anymore. If you can't see this, it says, there's a mother taking her child outside and says, see, this is called the outdoors. And the child says, I've seen this level on my video games. Richard Louv, who wrote the book Last Child in the Woods, there quotes a fourth grader that says, I like to play indoors because that's where all the electrical outlets are. So that's one of our issues. Climate change. Climate change is directly affecting our national parks. The glaciers in Glacier National Park are disappearing. Fires in the Sierras. If you've been up to Yosemite or Sequoia, you can certainly see the fires that we've had this season. They are burning longer and hotter than any time in recorded history. Sea level rise, storm surge are threatening our national seashores. Throughout all this hurricane season, there have been many of our national park units like Virgin Islands or the Dry Tortugas have gotten hammered as well. So this is sort of our new normal. There's also a strong disconnect with American history as well. This is a slide of the Edmund Pettus Bridge where the 1965 Voting Rights March occurred. And there is a surprising sort of disconnect with this period of American history with this millennial generation as well. And as certainly Sam can attest, there is a sort of an increasing partisan fighting over there's basic conservation issues like the protection of national parks, our oceans, and our public lands. And Sam was always there to defend them vociferously as well. To make things worse for the Park Service, for those who can't see it, there's a fallen sign here. The operating budgets of our parks and public lands have been in steady decline. It is more and more difficult to operate, to just bake the cake, as Karen indicated. And we are becoming more and more reliant on friends organizations like you to help us out to even do some of the basics, which is unfortunate because we think the federal government should be covering the basics. So when I took the job as the director, I could fight every one of these battles individually, but I felt that the centennial provided an opportunity to sort of reacquaint the American people with the National Park Service. For those that already sort of knew us, but also for those that perhaps did not. And I had evidence that this could work. And this may be familiar to some of you. 50 years ago, 1966, the Park Service partnered with the automobile industry to see the USA in your Chevrolet. That sound familiar to anybody out there? This was a campaign directed to the World War II veterans, specifically, to come back and sort of see what they fought for around the country. And in the back seats of those station wagons, as they traveled across the United States, was the boomer generation. And I imagine there are a few folks in here that were sitting in that back seat. There's one at least, with all the windows rolled down because there was no air conditioning. And those kids grew up to form the conservation community that we know today, the historic preservation community as well. There was also sort of the bedrock of conservation legislation came out of that period, sort of from the beginnings of of the 60s right through the 70s, we had the Wilderness Act, 1964, the National Historic Preservation Act, 64, Wild and Scenic Rivers Act, 68, Endangered Species Act, 1966, the National Environmental Policy Act, 1970, Clean Air Act, 1972, and it all sort of culminated with Earth Day in 1970. So this contact with parks and our public lands, coming from the World War II veterans and then the boomer generation, really built not only the conservation legislation, but the conservation community that exists today. So my theory behind the centennial was to create the next wave, this next generation of supporters, advocates, visitors for our national parks and our public lands as well. So we decided to focus on the millennial generation, to connect with them, to create the energy behind them, to create a new conservation movement as well. We decided to expand the national park system to include more representations of women and minorities, this case Harriet Tubman Underground Railroad National Monument, which we added to the system during my administration. And we did a bunch of other things. We decided to shift our public health program to invite people to get outside. We called it Take a Hike and Call Me in the Morning. We made parks free to every fourth grader in the nation. And we decided to raise significant private funds. As Karen indicated, we worked with the National Park Foundation and friends organizations across the nation, and we achieved unprecedented heights in terms of fundraising as well. And we decided to go big tent. The centennial was not just about the Park Service. It was about state parks and city parks and county parks and Forest Service and BLM and Fish and Wildlife Service and the Park Service as well. Our target market, as I mentioned, were the millennials, that sort of 18 to 35-year-old, technologically distracted part of our society, and to really empower them, or perhaps in some ways connect them for the very first time with their national parks. Now, I'm not going to go into a lot of detail here because I don't have that much time, but I want to touch on just a few things because conservation successes breed more success. And you have some, obviously, with Pinnacles, but I'm going to touch on a few more with that as well. The Channel Islands fox, just a little south of here, the Channel Islands, our Galapagos here in the United States. We have restored the Channel Islands fox, very cute little buggers. And we did it by removing sheep and elk and pigs and golden eagles and turkeys and rats from the Channel Islands, and we were able to delist the Channel Islands fox. Drake's Estero in Point Reyes National Seashore, long, complicated, controversial issue that ultimately went all the way to the Supreme Court, but ultimately we were able to remove an oyster farm there and restore the only marine wilderness on the Pacific coast as well. We are in the process of restoring the Mariposa Grove of giant sequoias in Yosemite. I would highly recommend you go see that next year. Pull the road system out. The Yosemite Conservancy raised $20 million, and we matched it with Park Service funds for a $40 million project, a really great restoration project as well. On the preservation side, as I mentioned, we've added some new parks. This one is Colonel Charles Young Buffalo Soldiers National Monument. As you know, the Buffalo Soldiers protected our parks in the very early days as well. The Belmont Paul Women's Equality National Monument in Washington, D.C. Pays homage to the women's suffrage movement. Cesar Chavez National Monument in La Paz here in California for the migrant farm workers movement. And Stonewall in New York City to talk about the rise of the LGBTQ movement as well. And of course here at Pinnacles National Park, the fantastic addition led by Sam Farr to convert this park, this monument, to national park status. He introduced the legislation, passed the House and the Senate, signed by President Obama in January of 2013 to establish Pinnacles National Park. Congratulations to all of you, Sam. So just a couple of stats from the Centennial, and you can't see this slide, so I'll just rattle a few of them off. We had 3,200 events. We had 108,000 fourth graders validate their passes. We had a $70 million Centennial Challenge Project program. 4 times we trended on social media higher than Beyonce. We had, according to our media campaign, we had 16.5 billion media impressions. I have no idea what that means, but it's a really big number. And we reached 1 in 4 of our target audience of the millennials. They learned about us through this process. And as Karen indicated earlier, we set a goal of raising $200 million privately, and we raised $400 million privately through that process. And Sam wanted me to tell you a quick story about at least a piece of that, and that was the largest contribution of land in the history of the Park Service was from Roxanne Quimby, the founder of Burt's Bees. Roxanne was a San Francisco flower child that moved to a cabin in rural Maine. She met a guy named Bert who made candles out of beeswax. She learned that the wax, making the candles on the wood stove, improved the condition of her hands. So she began to concoct various mixtures of that, began to market it locally. To make a long story short, she built the Burt's Bees brand. She sold it a number of years ago for $900 million to Clorox, by the way. But in the interim, while she was building her brand and her business, she bought North Maine Woods land. And she bought 87,500 acres of contiguous lands adjacent to Baxter State Park. She donated all 87,500 acres to the National Park Service to create a new Katahdin Woods National Monument in Maine with a $20 million endowment on top of it. So it is, this is a gift that rivals certainly the Rockefellers with Acadia and Grand Teton and the Virgin Islands as well. So. Visitation this past year, I know you've seen a bump in visitation. We had 330 million visitors that came to the National Park Service. That is more than all of Disney, all of national football, national baseball, national basketball, soccer, and NASCAR combined. I don't think the Park Service employees are clapping at that. Volunteers, we went up from about 225,000 to 339,000 volunteers, about 8 million hours. And I know there are many volunteers in this room, but we would never be able to do our work without the volunteers. So my hat's off to all of you. And this slide, I'm sure it would be important to you as well. One of our goals was to convert knowledge into activism. So knowledge and awareness of the national parks, we want to convert that into something. Visitation, to advocacy, and to philanthropy. And we saw a significant uptick, which I'm sure you probably also received as a result of all of that as well. So I think the Centennial was a success in a variety of ways. It probably annoyed the public to a certain degree with all of the attention as well. But a lot of this work could never have been done without Sam Farr. And I want to talk just briefly about Sam. I have a book coming out next year, and in that book, we talk about the hope that people with core values around conservation will seek public office. That going back and trying to convince somebody that doesn't have that core values to be in favor of conservation is a challenge, and we're certainly seeing it more and more so. But people like Sam, who had a record of conservation and deep appreciation for people and for the oceans and for social justice, carry that kind of value back with them to Washington. So in my book that's coming out, I'm going to read just a quote from it. It says, "To be elected in contemporary America, even at the local level, requires support, funding, political skill, media savvy, personal sacrifice, and very thick skin. There is no reason that individuals with strong conservation values and/or training in science cannot gain these attributes and be successfully elected to office." So Sam, I was thinking of Sam when I wrote that, actually, and that Sam provides, in many ways, the epitome of this call to action. He took to Washington those core values around conservation for our parks, public lands, and our oceans, and never really wavered at all from that commitment. So we honor him tonight for that devotion. And if you can see that, that's a picture of Sam at the dedication. So, am I supposed to hand you something now? Is that supposed to give you a plaque or something? You want me to do this first? Do you want me to go ahead and do with the folks from Congressman Panetta's office now? Or is that, I don't know the agenda here. Okay. All right. So, Congressman, you have been honored many times by a variety of bodies, but I'd like to introduce Karina Chavez from Congressman Panetta's office. And she will present resolutions on behalf of the U.S. Congress and the Monterey County Board of Supervisors.
Good evening. Buenas noches, everybody. My name is Karina. I see a lot of familiar faces in the room, especially one that I love, and that's Sam Farr. We all love Sam Farr. I'm here this evening to present a congressional resolution on behalf of Congressman Panetta. I worked for Sam for 15 years, and Congressman Panetta asked me to stay with him, and I'm continuing my service with Congressman Panetta in the 20th Congressional District. But I was invited to be here this evening, and I jumped at it because the Pinnacles and Sam Farr, they mean so much to you and to all of us. I was with Sam for about 15 years, and I never went to visit the Pinnacles. And I grew up in the small town of Soledad. And so one of the first times that we were down there, Sam said, you know, we need to go do some federal inventory. And he took me up there to see the beautiful rocks there at the Pinnacles. And it amazed me because Sam truly is and has been one of the best congressmen that we've had. He is really a true representative of the people, and has so many values that I know he instilled in myself, and I just want to make sure that I was here for him this evening. So I have I know he's very familiar with these because we wrote a lot of these in his office, and these are congressional resolutions. And so this was written by Sam Farr staff, myself and Alec, his former district director. And so I'm just going to read a little bit about how the process, of the congressman took to create Pinnacles National Park, our 59th National Park. So it says here, Mr. Speaker, the Pinnacles is truly a remarkable place, but the Pinnacles National Park is more than its stunning scenery. The remnant of 23-million-year-old volcano, the San Andres Fault, carried the Pinnacles several hundred miles north to its present location. Its unique habitat for an island of biodiversity that is home to numerous unique plant and animal species, including the California condor and over 400 species of bees. It is a place for people. It is a place a place for people, the indigenous Amamatsun peoples lived amongst, traveled through, and revered the Pinnacles for thousands of years. In the 5 years since its elevation to national park status, even more people have come to visit the Pinnacles. This has provided a remarkable boost for the surrounding communities, economies, who have seen increase in its hospitality. Prior to arriving to Congress, this is from Congressman Pineda, I heard Sam tell the story that the idea to author legislation initially came during a Rotary meeting in a community near the Pinnacles. A Rotarian suggested that making the Pinnacles a national park would help the local economy. Sam took that idea, added the environmental conservation element, and crafted legislation that would garner widespread support. He found a Republican partner in our colleague, Jeff Denham. Together, they helped steer a bill through House and ultimately, again, signed by President Obama. And it ends by Mr. Pineda saying, Congressman Pineda saying, Mr. Speaker, I know I speak for the whole House in thanking Sam for his years of service, and in particular for his efforts to designate Pinnacles National Park. The Honorable Sam Farr has given us a living postcard we can send to our children and grandchildren. Our community is forever grateful for his service. So thank you so much.
Okay. Sam, why don't you come on up here? You're easier to embarrass if you're up here. You're going to need a extra garage for all these plaques. So this one is from the Senate of the state of California, certificate of recognition. On behalf of the California State Senate, I would like to honor you for being selected as the first recipient of the Sam Farr Pinnacles Service Award for Pinnacles National Park Foundation. And it really goes on to say what a great job you did in getting this national park established as well. So, and I think there's one here also from the Monterey County Board of Supervisors as well.
Thank you.
But now it's your turn.
Well, thank you very much, John. Thank you for coming to this event, and thank you all. It's so essential now in modern times to have a support system, a private support system for things that we love. And I can't thank you enough for creating a foundation to help support a trust to help the Pinnacles, because we're going to need that for value added. And I think you're all here because you appreciate what the Pinnacles is, but I don't think everybody who lives in the Monterey Bay Area understands the significance of being able to make this a park. And my background growing up, my father was very involved in probably the first state legislator that was really involved, could be called an environmental legislator. I remember he was always accused of being a posy-picking senator by people who didn't like him banning billboards and things like that. But he had some friends that hung around the house, and one of them was Ansel Adams. And when I first ran for the state assembly in 1980, I went to Ansel's house, and I asked him if he would support being a campaign chairman for me. And he kind of looked at me and says, well, what does that entail? I said, Mr. Adams, and I think I called him Ansel, I said, it doesn't really entail anything. You just have to lend me your name. You're an honorary chairman. He said, oh, I can do that. And then he starts pulling out some photographs. He says, here, you're going to have to raise money. Why don't you sell my photographs? I sold one, and the other one is in our house. And then, the Big Sur fight was on to do the local coastal plan for Big Sur and for the whole coast, and I got involved as a local person on the regional coastal commission. And then I went to the state legislature, and I realized that really a lot of our economy was based on tourism, and nobody really focused on. Tourism is an easy thing to think about, but it's very hard to organize because it's everything. It's rental car agencies, it's airlines, it's restaurants, hotels, it's aquariums and parks and everything like that are all under this category. And they all have their own silos, but never get together as sort of a part of an industry. So we created a caucus to educate people in the legislature about tourism. And as I went to Washington, and I'd been very involved in these things, people ask me when I get to Washington, well, what do you do in your district? Sort of everybody asks, what are your district all about? And so much of the Midwest, it's all about, well, we do corn or we do oil down in Arkansas and Texas and areas like that. And so when it came to me, I said, well, we just sell scenery. And everybody kind of laughed, and they said, yeah, you have the most beautiful district in the world. Why would you even leave it to come back here? You're nuts. It took me 23 years of Congress to realize that they were right. But in that process of thinking about how we sell scenery, and it struck me that what we really sell in our scenery is what we call the Central Coast. We sell the Santa Cruz Boardwalk, the Santa Cruz Mountains a little bit, the Redwoods, not so much, but mostly coastline surfing. We sell Cannery Row, Pebble Beach, Big Sur. We really sell the coast. And as I was on the Agriculture Committee, because of Dick Nutter, who was our Agriculture Commissioner, was a supervisor and had a great ability to understand the value of aesthetics. I mean, I've always think that Vic, you're really the pioneer of sort of showing that agriculture and environmentalists have one thing in common. We both like open space. And how do you now preserve open space? You're not going to just all buy it out, and it's not all going to be publicly owned land. And we wouldn't have the resources to manage it and just couldn't do it. So we also have to make sure that those are in livestock, cattle businesses and row crops and things like that they have a sustainable economy too, because that's going to keep our air quality nice and our scenery around here nice. So in selling scenery was, okay, we have to really make it economically viable for our rural areas. And I think that's the big push. We know how to make a lot of money doing urban sprawl in California. And our history has all been urban sprawl because we've had so much open spaces. Just go over the mountain and, there's another valley after that. There's another forest. Just take it. And we really have to stop that. Well, how do you stop it and make businesses successful? Well, then you have to bring some economic development to the rural areas. So Pinnacles, as you heard, John, who I just adore, because I think you're the best park director we've ever had. You're just, a great leader. It was about, the rural area, and it was true, is in the San Juan Bautista Rotary Club, very small little town, and they said, they had a former park director who had retired and lived there, and he just said, why don't you in Congress, only Congress can make a national park. There's no other, you can't use the Antiquities Act for the president to declare it like we do in national monuments. And so I had been doing with national monuments, I got the entire coastline from Oregon to Mexico, all of what we call the rocks and islands, pinnacles, all the rocks offshore. And Bruce Babbitt was here as Secretary of Interior under Bill Clinton, and we were out on Rocky Point, and I pointed out, I said, I have a bill in Congress, I can't even get it heard in committee. And he said, we'd put all these rocks out here and all along the California coastline into wilderness status, because the BLM owns that. I didn't even know that. And he said, that's a great idea. He said, why don't you send me a copy of the bill? So this was the last month that Clinton was in office, and I sent Bruce Babbitt a copy and gave him the history of how I'd introduced the bill. I had Republican co-sponsors, but we couldn't, the Resources Committee wouldn't even hear it. So about a week later, he calls me back, and he said, what are you doing a week from now? I said, why? What are you asking? And he says, can you be in the Grand Canyon? And I said, why? And he says, because the president is going to do, President Clinton is going to do a declaration of monuments, Grand Canyon, the land around Grand Canyon, and he's going to put your rocks and islands into that declaration. And so I want you to be there. So I have this strange picture of Bill Clinton and myself and Bruce Babbitt sitting out in the middle. They signed this bill. You had to fly on Air Force, on Helicopter One, Marine One, out in the middle of nowhere. They had a few toilets, outhouses brought in, and a table, and nobody there. A few press, a little press, but not much. I thought this is not going to get much publicity. So we have a picture of all of us sitting out there at this little table. That's really strange. Well, that's how we made the rocks and pinnacles. So that's incredible. And the whole question was, why do you want it there? What's wrong? They're not going to. These have been there for millions of years, and there's nothing wrong. I said, yeah. But what's happening is everybody wants to put in cell towers, and because the BLM, Bureau of Land Management, can lease out for commercial purposes, like to do for mining and timbering and grazing, they can also lease these rocks for billboards or for cell towers or for, somebody wants to do a light show offshore. I mean, who knows what they're going to do? So let's just protect it by putting it in wilderness status, and that's how we got it. And then we did I did a bill under George Bush to put all of the Los Padres into wilderness and to create the Silver Peak Wilderness in southern Los Padres on the San Luis Obispo County line. So when it got around to doing Pinnacles, I knew that it was going to be really hard to get a bill creating a national park because the mood wasn't there and they weren't going to hear it in committee. And so all I did is I said, this is just a low-key bill. It's going to help our little rural community of Soledad. We don't have to buy any land, because if we had to buy any land, they would have said no. I said, we don't even have to buy uniforms. They're already in uniform. This bill just allows us to put a little sign out there to change it from a monument to a park. So low-key it, and it gets all the way through, and I get it into the Senate. And Barbara Boxer's always been, she's great, because she said, I'm going to get this done for you. In fact, we were in a restaurant having dinner together, and she just pulls out her iPad and says, well, your bill just passed without on a consent calendar in the Senate. And that created, and then was really interesting is I get the bill to the White House, and I'm wondering why aren't they asking me to come over for a bill signing ceremony or something? So I called Valerie Jarrett, who was Barack Obama's staff, and she said, well, we don't know whether we're going to sign this bill. I said, what do you mean? It's the only park that you're ever going to be able to create under your administration. It's the 59th National Park, 59th in the history of the United States. Don't you want to take credit for this? Well, Sam, we're really interested in economic development, and we want to know how many jobs are going to be created by this national park. And oh, my God. And then I almost, said something foul and hung up on her. But I turned to my staff, and I said, we got to get some economics on the value. And thanks, John Jarvis, I think we called him, and he said, those are out there. Those studies have been done. So we get the information to the White House that this is really going to be a job creator, and the president signs it, and we have a park. Now, what's interesting about this is that it far exceeds anybody's imagination of how many jobs creating that national park has done. It has taken the Soledad, and Karina grew up there, and I remember we were down there, and I said, you've never been to this park right behind your city? She said, no, nobody went. I said, well, weren't you in high school? Didn't you drive up there and neck or something? She said, I thought I was offended by that, but anyway. So I took her up there, and that's probably when I started having the idea that we're going to make it into a national park. So anyway, what it's done is that Soledad immediately put out a sign saying gateway to the national park. And I was down there last year talking to the mayor, and he said, Sam, do you know how many investors have come into this town now? We were a forgotten town. He said, we have the Soledad Mission. We have all these wineries. We now have people coming in here wanting to build hotels. They want to invest in restaurants. This is the gateway to the national. And there's an inn up there that was sort of catering to the wine industry that was about failing, and it's just booming right now. And I think on the east side, I still think Hollister and San Juan Bautista can do a lot more. But I think that there's an opportunity to really seize this national icon, because it really is what was, Ken Burns was the guy that put it over the top, because he did a series on the national parks. And when I was first asked to do it, I thought, well, I know Yosemite and I know Kings Canyon and Sequoia, and I said, I don't think Pinnacles is up there. It's not that big and important. Until he did a series, and he had some series on very small national parks. So I had my staff look at, and I said, well, we have more real estate than a lot of these other national parks in the east. So we have enough real estate. We have to have and it also is a home to the California condor, and it was the only park that actually had the condor in it. And so when I called Ken Burns after a series and introduced myself as a congressman who was interested in doing a bill, I said, what do you think? Do you know about the Pinnacles? He said, I grew up in the East Bay, Sam. He said, I used to go to the Pinnacles all the time as a kid. I love that place. He said, you ought to do it. And I said, well, what do you think is the ask here? What is it to tell? Why Pinnacles? Why do we need that? And this is a letter that Karen has that he wrote to me, and I framed it because it's he's such a great writer. He said, Sam, think of it this way. The National Park Service, each park, the 58 parks, has been chosen because it's a representation of flora or fauna or geography places, whether lowlands, mountains, everything, streams, glaciers. He said, what's missing in that National Park Library is the book on the tectonic plate movements. He said, no park has that. And that's what the Pinnacles is. It's the San Andreas fault line. And he said, I said, oh, that's terrific. I said, can you come testify on my bill? And we looked at a date that we were going to have the hearing, and he couldn't make it. But I said, would you write a letter in support? And he said, sure enough. So he did. I tried to get him out for the dedication. But he really nailed it. And what is interesting about having this national park now, it's on the east side. It's no longer just come to the Central Coast to see pretty scenery on the coast. It's not just Big Sur anymore. It's the Salinas Valley. It's the Pajaro Valley. It's San Benito County. It is a monument for the entire other side of this great area. This area where California was born, where ranching began, where government began, where commerce began. And you know what? When you think back on how it all began over sea otters. You know why? Because the Russians were hunting sea otters and sea lions. And the Spanish government, they then came up here and hadn't come back for 100 years. They said when we went up there, Cabrillo came up, there's nothing there. But when they found that the Russians were coming down hunting animals, hunting the sea otters, they said, we got to get up there. And so they came back 100 years later, and this time they brought padres with them. I call them the defense contractors because they're going to set up these communities. The Franciscans came here because the government paid them by giving them, brought them up here on ships. It's interesting that they decided to come in a very ecologically friendly way. They're going to take non-motorized vehicles, sailing vessels, build out of recyclable wood, and come up to the coast and leave people here. But that's how our civilization began, over politics of sea otter. But the thing that drove them here in the first instance, why Monterey, was the scenery. Had it not been the scenery, they came all the way up the California coast, and why did they decide to come ashore in Monterey? Because of the scenery, because of the trees, and because of the shape of the land. So if we're really going to leave this Central Coast as it was born out of beauty, born out of appreciation for animals, and we're going to leave an economic vitality by attracting people here, then we've got to do whatever we can to not only preserve, but to interpret. The aquarium's done a great job about the oceans. We have a lot more to do. The Park Service, both local, state, and federal, has a lot to do. And I think if we sustain this economy, that we can keep agriculture viable, we can keep open space viable, we will indeed leave this land to our children as we found it. Thank you very, very much. Very interesting, this is a award that I'm giving to myself. It says the Sam Farr Pinnacles Service Award presented to Sam Farr. It's really presented to all of you because you all elected me, and thank you for doing that. It's our pleasure.
Ladies and gentlemen, the silent auction will be closing in about 10 minutes, so we'd like you to get up, check your bids, make your final bids, and in about 10 minutes, we will close the auction. Here's your chance to buy gifts for family, relatives, trips, tours. Christmas is not that far away. It's a great opportunity to buy a Christmas gift. Again, don't forget to get those final bids in. Holidays are coming up. Great time to buy a Christmas gift.